Hello, everyone. It's just about 2 o'clock where we are. Welcome to today's presentation. We'll get started just as close to 2 as we can. Another Zoom presentation has worked out very well for our educational outreach, and we're very lucky and very fortunate and very glad to offer today's topic, advanced birding, plus a surprise crash course in ornithology, brought to us today by our friend Brian Magnier, who's here joining us from Oregon. So the magic of Zoom has allowed us to bring educational opportunities from almost all around the world. My name is James. My picture is Julia. I'll be hanging on, watching the question and answer, the Q&A. If you do have any questions along the way, or if you'd like Brian to go into anything a little bit further, please don't hesitate to use that Q&A feature. Brian, we're gonna kind of save up the questions to the end so that everyone can benefit from the answers. Today's presentation and Brian are both brought to us by the Friends of Brooker Creek Preserve. We're here in Tarpon Springs, Florida. We are an education center, part of IFAS Extension, and our educational programs are supplemented by the generosity of our Friends group. If you'd like more information on how you can get involved with the Friends of Brooker Creek Preserve, Google it. They have their own website with lots of great information there. Enough from me. I've gone 60 seconds over. So thank you, Brian, for joining us today, and we're ready to be dazzled.
Well, thank you for having me. So today we're going to look a little bit more at a deeper dive into birding, and some background on ornithology, some other bird type topics. And so for most of us, if you're joining me on this lecture, I think you're probably already a bit interested in nature. Maybe you've been to Brooker Creek Preserve in Florida there, and you kind of, maybe you have some bird feeders out in your backyard. You probably kind of know what you're looking at some of the times, but maybe you're looking to kind of break past that next barrier because it is a very steep learning curve to go from kind of backyard bird watching to doing some intense birding. And so hopefully this will give you some little tips and tricks to start bridging that gap and maybe get you interested into kind of the world of birding. So with that, we will hop in, and we've got a lot of stuff to cover. So I might move a little bit fast some places, but definitely, as James mentioned in the Q&A, let me know if you want me to go back to any slides at the end. I can slow down, go into more detail. But basically, we're gonna talk a little bit about why we're interested in birds, me in particular, but hopefully you guys too. A brief look at bird phylogeny, some gear that you might need to use to watch birds, bird anatomy, a little bit about molting patterns and feathers, what habitats you can find birds in, especially in Central Florida. Just a little touch on migration and flight patterns. We'll talk about birding by ear a little bit, using bird sounds and calls to identify birds. We'll take a bit of time to look at some tricky species. So we'll have a lot of slides of pictures of some of those birds that look really similar and might give somebody a little bit of trouble, even if you do have a field guide with you. We'll look at escapees, introduced species, talk a little bit about Ebird. I love Ebird. If you've joined me on any of my talks here in the past, I've mentioned Ebird or iNaturalist in almost every one of them. And then we'll finish up looking at some cool species and some interesting behaviors that you can go check out in the birding world. So why are so many people, including me, interested in birds? Sure, they can fly, which is pretty cool, but so can bugs and bats. So I don't think that's the whole reason. And they can be visually stunning, with crazy patterns and colors. Many vocalize, singing beautiful melodies or haunting wails and hoots. And these reasons are important, but I think there's one last piece to the puzzle that really makes birds so intriguing to so many people. And I think that's the level of bird diversity. There's not too much diversity. Insects have 100 times as many species as birds, and they can be just overwhelming to study and identify a species especially. Mammals have a decent level of diversity with around 5,000 species, but they're generally much less visible. Most mammal diversity is comprised of rodents and bats, and there aren't many places in the world where you can see more than a dozen species of mammals just by walking around. I've often called birds kind of the gateway drug into becoming a more general naturalist. There are always enough birds to go out and see at least some. There's not so many that you can't learn and identify all of the birds in your area, but pretty much no matter where you go on Earth, you can see or hear about 100 species of birds with relatively little effort. And that's a pretty manageable number. You can learn 100 species of birds to identify. Obviously, that number goes up a bit if you live in the tropics. But even then, in a day, you can probably see 100 species of birds, and that'd be a good day. With 10,000 species of birds, it helps to be able to break them down into similar groups. And the easiest level of grouping that we use to grasp the birds are families. And you already know a few of the bird families. Owls comprise one bird family, hummingbirds another. And if we start combining the DNA evidence and fossils and morphology, we can figure out the relatedness of all of these families, and we can start to piece together when in geologic time these families evolved. So some of the earliest families include what we now know as ostriches, emus, rheas, and cassowaries. These are big flightless birds, probably most reminiscent of their dinosaur ancestors. And we could spend an entire semester talking about just phylogenetics. But for now, let's try and take away just a couple of key points. Birds are an evolutionary offshoot of dinosaurs and started to diversify when a giant meteor crashed into the Earth and pushed all of the large dinosaurs to extinction. That happened about 66, 65 million years ago. And by just 20 to 30 million years ago, almost all of these modern families of birds were taking shape. So even though each individual species that you know and love may not have evolved yet, you could hop into a time machine, go back 10 or 20 million years, and you'd probably be able to ID the birds that you saw into pretty much their family groups: ducks, owls, hummingbirds, things like that. So apart from a time machine though, what gear are we going to use to watch birds? What do we actually use here? In general, birds tend to be pretty small and often far away. So the main equipment is some form of optics. We need lenses, binoculars, spotting scopes, anything to get a good look at these little creatures to enjoy them and possibly identify them. And if you're going to invest in a pair of binoculars, which I definitely recommend, you don't have to spend thousands of dollars to get something decent. It takes maybe a couple $100, and that'll give you a pair that will really make all the difference in the world, and it'll last years and years. I keep my binoculars with me pretty much all the time, and I use them literally every day, and they're still in good shape after over a decade of use. Plus, they're not just useful for looking at birds. Here I am looking at a stingray in a tide pool, and this is not the only stingray that I've admired through my binoculars. Long telephoto lenses, they're helpful for taking pictures and videos of birds, but they are heavy and expensive, not necessarily what everybody needs or wants. But if you're going to shell out the big bucks for camera gear and a camo blanket, then maybe you'd probably want to also invest in a pair of boots that's a bit more inconspicuous than mine here. Just recommending not bright yellow boots for the camo look. Okay, so we have our binoculars. We can see the birds, but do we know what we're looking at? Birds don't always look the same. Even a single species can be completely different from season to season or between the males and females. Of course, when we look at a bird, we mostly see its feathers. They're pretty much covered in feathers. So it helps to be a bit familiar with these groups of feathers. Without even looking at the diagram, you know where the head and the belly and the tail are. But what about the primaries versus the secondaries? So we've got primaries, kind of the wing, the outer wing feathers. The secondaries would be kind of more like an elbow. The upper tail and undertail coverts, kind of the rump, and then the undertail coverts under here near the vent. These are terms that come in handy when trying to describe an unknown bird to somebody, or when trying to picture a description. If you've got a field guide and it's telling you what to look for, maybe it says that the secondaries are dark, relative to the primaries. That can be important if you want to really start identifying birds, is to start knowing where some of these feather groups are. Feathers eventually get worn down and damaged, so periodically birds have to molt into fresh plumage. Some species, such as owls, keep the same patterns and colors year-round, and whether they're male or female. Generally, owls look pretty much the same. Other birds change quite dramatically, and it can be important to learn what plumage to expect in a given season. The terminology here in this slide is extremely confusing, but it can be kind of helpful to start learning, when birds are molting. Maybe you're seeing a plumage that isn't in the field guide. So a lot of these different terms kind of mean the same things. But what I want you to take away from this diagram is basically we start as a baby bird over here, spring and summer. They start all fluffy or naked. Then they quickly get this juvenile plumage. So the words here are the molts, and then the color, the blocks are the plumage. So the molt kind of turns into the plumage. So once they're these juvenile plumage, then they molt, the post-juvenile molt, which gives them their formative plumage, which is kind of what the adult would look like in the winter. And then they would molt again in the spring and look like their summer or spring plumage here. And so this diagram is a bit confusing. Again, we can return to it at the end if people really want to. But basically what you want to learn from this is that some songbirds can go through, all of these different stages. So it doesn't just go from a baby bird to looking like the adult. There can be some confusing little in-between stages there. And then here's way, way more info than you probably care about. And I'll skip over this slide and the next one for now. But if anybody's really interested in molting patterns and all the terminology, let me know in the chat or Q&A, and I can return to these guys at the end here. Just very, there's a lot of intense science that goes on with all of the molting patterns of different birds. Gulls are kind of these really difficult to ID birds, not just because they look so similar to each other, but because they can look so different from themselves at different stages of their life. So gulls go through all of these different plumages for like 3 years before they kind of settle in on their adult plumage. So that's one reason why gulls can be so frustrating to try and ID. One particular example of molt that's important for Florida birding is to recognize this little blue heron here, which looks very different depending on its age. It starts out looking pretty much like a snowy egret, pure white. And then during the molting period, once it's about a year old, it'll get this cool, ghostly blue-gray sort of feathering in between the white stage and its nice adult kind of gray-blue and the maroon. And so this is one, if I had to pick one bird that was kind of consistently confusing people and people thinking it was an egret, the little blue heron's a really good one to learn. Now birds generally, they can't molt everything all at once, like a snake shedding its skin or this grasshopper molting. This is because birds need their feathers to fly as well as for insulation, and it takes time to regrow the feathers. One exception to this kind of rule here is with penguins, which undergo something called catastrophic molt, which looks more than a little bit hilarious. These are not my pictures, but penguins don't need to fly, but without a complete coat, they would not be able to dive for fish in their icy cold water without freezing to death. So they need to get this molt over really quickly. So after the breeding season, they basically just go poof, and then they get all of their new feathers really quickly. Again, here's a bit more depth of info than probably necessary about molting and feather growth. I can return to it at the end if anybody's particularly interested in kind of the cellular level of what's going on with feather growth and then molting patterns, because some birds will molt feathers in different orders, which can be kind of interesting if you see a bird flying and it's, maybe a vulture and they've got their big wingtip feathers and they're missing one. You might kind of want to know why is it missing that feather? What stage of molting is it at? Or is that an injury? So we can come back to this if people really want to. Molting and breeding are both very energetically demanding times. So it isn't great to do them at the same time. Plus, if a parent bird needs to be constantly catching food for its young and for itself, it doesn't want to be in the middle of molting its wing feathers, which might make it less efficient at flying. And so this figure here shows the frequency of birds through the summer that were in breeding condition, kind of these gray bars, compared to those that were in molting condition, kind of these black bars here. And as you can see, it's kind of cool. Basically, the molting peaked right after the breeding was done. So once all of the birds, once the kids left the nest, the parents had, a moment to themselves. That's when they molt and they get all their nice new fresh feathers. So another thing, important thing to be aware of when birding is the habitat. If you want to see a roseate spoonbill or even an anhinga, you might be wasting your time walking through this dry, sandy palmetto scrub habitat. But if you were looking for scrub jays or maybe a bobwhite, then you'd be in the right place. So knowing what birds like what habitats is very important to being able to find them with any regularity. Some of the other major habitat types in Florida include the mangroves, which can be a great place to find wading birds like ibis, herons. Sometimes the spoonbills are in here in the water. Forests, full of songbirds, especially during spring migration. But because it's tougher to spot birds in a thick forest with all the branches and leaves and maybe birds are high up in the canopy, this is an especially important place to know your bird calls. So birding by ear, I think, is really, really helpful if you want to find songbirds in a forest sort of habitat. Wetlands and ponds, no short supply of them in Florida. They're a great place to find ducks and grebes, herons and limpkins, osprey, and then songbirds, especially during spring and fall migration. And the edges of these wetlands with their dense reeds and cattails, those kind of little spots hold some of the most cryptic and sought after birds, such as rails and bitterns. Here, a little least bittern pokes his head out of the reeds, and this is the smallest of the little, the herons. They're just like a little football sitting there in the swamp. So we'll change gears a bit here, move on to migration. You may have noticed that not all birds that you can see in Florida are present year-round. Some birds fly up from South America to breed here in the summer, like the swallow-tailed kite, while others spend the winter in Florida, escaping the cold of the more northern states. But then maybe they migrate away in the springtime. Still others pass right on by, only found in Florida for a few weeks in spring and fall. So one really good resource to keep track of which birds are where is Ebird. And looking at these bar charts, we can get a good sense of what species to expect during different months. So we've got January on the left at the top here, December on the right, so we've got our year. And then we've got a bunch of different species of birds here, focused here on the warblers. And kind of the thicker green bars mean more birds of that species have been reported during that time period. So we can see here that the northern parula, let's see, this guy here, is a resident of Florida. You can see them in any month. And then the blackpoll warbler, on the other hand, let's go with this guy. It's only recorded during April and May. And there are no sightings of blackpoll warbler from Central Florida, January, February, or July or August. It's only found there in the migration. So Ebird here with the bar charts, it's a great resource for keeping track of the timing of the arrival and departure of different species. And then these seasonal patterns, they're often shown as range maps in field guides. Here's the range map for that yellow-rumped warbler, which winters in Florida. And then in the winter, they look brown and streaky, like this bottom photo here, dressed in camouflage rather than for show. But then come springtime, they'll molt into this nice handsome plumage, and you might see a few of them lingering around in this plumage in Florida, but most of them, they head north and they start breeding up in Canada, and that's where you get to see this nice breeding plumage of the yellow-rumped warbler. So, but how do they find their way north? Do they have a little compass hiding under their feathers? Kind of, actually. It's been shown that some birds have a sort of magnetic sense and are aware of their position relative to the Earth's magnetic field. Observations and experimental evidence have shown that birds use a combination of tactics to navigate. Landmarks such as mountains and coastlines are used, as are the position of the sun during the day, constellations at night, and then even deep, far-reaching sounds like the distant rumble of waves on the shore can be used, or maybe the smell on the breeze, like the salty smell of the ocean. These are all things that birds can use to keep track of where they are and where they're headed. Okay, so let's take a breath. Now that we've got a decent knowledge about just kind of ornithology and where we might see some birds, some different habitats, let's talk about identifying some birds in the field. Even at a long distance away, one of the first characteristics you may notice about a bird is how it is flying. Even from over a mile away, you can tell the difference between a woodpecker and a vulture just by the way they move through the air. The best way to learn flight patterns is not really to study them in a book, but to go outside with a birder who, is somebody who's knowledgeable and, they know what they're talking about, and just get a feel for how they appear in real life. You've probably already watched a hawk or an eagle soaring through the sky, rarely flapping its wings, and noticed how different that is from a hummingbird hovering and darting about, flapping its wings hundreds and hundreds of times a minute. So woodpeckers and finches, like goldfinches, they have an undulating flight, but woodpeckers are almost always alone. You don't really see a flock of woodpeckers. While finches fly together in big groups. So if you see a lone bird, maybe a medium-sized bird undulating through the air, then that's a decent chance that could be a woodpecker. You could at least narrow down the field guide to just a few different birds. So couple that flight pattern with the approximate size of the bird and then the habitat you're in, and then you can very quickly narrow down a mystery bird from a few hundred potential species in a given area down to just maybe 3 or 4. And that becomes a lot easier to identify. Perhaps the biggest gap in knowledge between beginning birders and then the more seasoned experts is the ability to bird by ear. If you can hike around and be able to identify and then locate birds just by sound, that makes an enormous difference. First of all, it frees up your eyes to watch the trail for roots or snakes, so that you can, keep hiking and still be aware of everything that's around you. And then even if you only know the common species, when you hear something you don't recognize, then you can be confident that it's worth trying to pin down and get an eye on because it's different. It's not one of the common ones. So for Florida, there's a few that I really recommend you try learning first if you want to get into learning the bird sounds and songs. So there's a very steep learning curve when it comes to really being familiar with the songs and calls. And most people, when they walk through the woods, they enjoy the general soundscape, but are generally unaware of the myriad sounds and the identities behind them. But when you start learning the bird songs, it can be really overwhelming, especially in springtime now, with so many neotropical migrants coming through, singing, and singing and calling are kind of different things, and birds can have different songs and calls. But it is doable with enough time and practice, and this is the list that I recommend you start with for Florida. These are 10 species, I'd say some of the most common and vocal species that you'll come across. And if you can confidently ID these 10 by ear, it'll be a huge advantage. You'll start being able to just filter them out, and really, that's maybe half of everything you hear. You'll be able to just ID it automatically. So once you recognize these guys, then you can identify any new strange sounds, and then you can figure out, oh, okay, that's the one I want to go try and find and get my binoculars on, because I know that this sound over here is a wren and that one's a blackbird, and So I don't, I've seen them already today. So let's try and find this weird sound over there. A few good references here for learning those bird songs. If you just want to hear the songs and calls of a few specific North American species, definitely I would start with All About Birds, Cornell's kind of general field guide website. But for lots more recordings covering almost every species on Earth, Zeno Canto is a really great place to go. But then if you want to systematically learn all of the songs and calls for your area, then there's a number of good guides you can download or purchase. And one of the most famous is the Stokes Field Guide to Bird Songs, which I had kind of as a collection of CDs back in the day when CDs were a thing. And that's a great way. They go through bird songs that sound similar, and they actually will tell you the differences between them rather than just playing a bunch of songs in a row. And then there's some secretive birds like the rails and the owls that you can almost only detect by sound, especially if they're nocturnal. And you have to increase your chances of finding them. It's really helpful to be able to identify all the different sounds that they will make. So one way of representing sounds visually is with a spectrogram. And you'll sometimes find songs or calls drawn this way in field guides. And it's also a way that you could record sounds in the fields. If you keep a little notebook, recording what birds you've seen, and you hear a strange sound that you want to identify later, but maybe you can't, get a recording of it on your smartphone or something, it can be helpful to jot down a quick representation of what the sound looks like so that you can remember it later. So high pitch sounds are at the top, low pitched here at the bottom. Color or boldness here shows the volume or intensity, and then time going left to right. So this sound here would be anybody recognize that? The northern cardinal. So that's a pretty common bird, and if you know the sound, then you can find it if you want to see one, or you can kind of ignore it if you know that it's common and you're trying to find something else. So even after studying bird songs and flight patterns, there are still a number of groups of birds that can be really tough to ID. Even with good binoculars in hand and a field guide in your backpack, shorebirds are particularly tricky. One good trick is to kind of ID them to rough groups. So with these four here, these three, kind of the top left three, are all about the same size. They're very small, brown shorebirds, white bellies. But this guy on the bottom right, he kind of stands out. He's bigger, he's got a thicker bill, doesn't have the white belly. And so you can kind of start picking out, okay, I know I've got these guys, and then this guy's different, and it can be easier to start identifying them once you know how many different species you're dealing with. In this case, these are four different species, three that are kind of smaller sandpipers. We've got the semi-palmated sandpiper, least sandpiper with his really short bill. That's why he's the least, it's the smallest. The dunlin, kind of with his characteristic drooping bill there. You can just kind of barely see it kind of bends down. It's not perfectly straight. And then the willet, a very common, slightly larger shorebird that generally stands out from the crowd. But they're very common, and so you can see them on many beaches throughout Florida. But that's not the only shorebirds we have. Here are the plovers, and they can be very similar, with all of their little neck patterns with their bands, their little black facial markings. But if you can count the number of bands and you can get a kind of an overall sense of the size and the color, then you can start breaking down some of these really similar guys. So we've got the semi-palmated plover, not to be confused with the semi-palmated sandpiper. Semi-palmated plover is very common, brown back, just kind of one major neck band here, compared to the killdeer, which is more common actually in like fields. You can see it not necessarily just on the beach. You can see it in parking lots, big open areas. This guy has the very bold black neck and breast bands here. Contrast those with these whiter, the snowy plover and the piping plover. And they've both got kind of one neck band and a little bit of a forehead band here. The snowy plover, it's kind of more white gray all over and has a black bill. The piping plover has got this, orange bill. It's kind of got more of a tan back. There's subtle differences, but when you're in the field, if you can get a picture of them especially, these are things that'll be very helpful. I mentioned the Dunlin with its little drooping bill. Some of them, these guys change dramatically from non-breeding plumage to breeding plumage. So these are both Dunlin. The one on the left, much easier to identify. Breeding plumage, it's got this black belly. You can ID these guys from really far away. But if they're in their non-breeding plumage, like in the winter, if you go down to kind of the Gandy Causeway near Weedon Island, there'll be a whole bunch of these Dunlin, and it can be tough to identify them in the winter without their colors. And so this little drooping bill is that's a really good field mark to be on the lookout for. That willet, that first one that I said kind of stands out, maybe it's a little more obvious than the other shorebirds. Even those guys can look quite different from time to time. These are both willets here, different lighting conditions, different time of the year, but pay attention to the size and the shape. These guys are always larger than most of the shorebirds. They've got these long, kind of pretty thick, straight, stout bills. And they always have this similar body shape. They don't have really long necks, like avocets or stilts. They're pretty stocky shorebirds. Some sandpipers are so similar that honestly, I wouldn't be confident identifying them, and I barely would spend the energy even trying. I've seen thousands of the common semi-palmated sandpiper here on the right, but I could look right at this rare little stint in a flock of semi-palms and probably not think anything of it. But it's this vagrant from Eurasia that everybody would get really excited if you were to find one. But they're just differentiated by this warmer orange tinge on these flight feathers. And so that is one that, even I leave to the more experienced, more dedicated shorebird people. So here are pretty much all of the potential shorebirds that Florida has to offer using those bar charts from Ebird again. Again, the thicker green bars denote the more common species. So some of these are rarely seen in the state. You've got some vagrant things in here, Baird sandpiper, pretty much never seen, purple sandpiper. But even so, there are about 20 species of shorebirds to be aware of when you're birding at the beach or the coastal mudflats. So that can be, that's a lot to keep track of. And so to really learn them, I would say either go out with a birder that knows their stuff or try and get some pictures and then really sit with those pictures and a field guide and just kind of sort through different ID characteristics. Wing shape, the bill shape especially is a big one, the bill color, leg color, all of these little marks are important. Another group that can pose problems are the white herons and egrets. Luckily, there's not so many species of them as there are with the sandpipers and plovers, but these species are so common in Florida that it's very helpful to be able to quickly tell them apart. General size and shape combined with a close look at the beak is what you want to get a positive ID on these guys. So snowy egrets down here, bottom left, small and slender, sharp, long, black beak, and these yellow lores, pretty much always there. They also often have a bit of a crest, kind of a puffy little back of their head. And they are just, let's see, they're just small, elegant, very sharp bill. And they often have that fluffy crest, like I said, but also fluffy chest and tail feathers. Whereas cattle egrets, just above the snowy here, they're stockier. They've got that thick orange beak and often kind of tan orange feathers that the snowy egrets will not have. Great egrets, much larger, very slender, very sharp yellow-orange beak, much of a sharper, thinner beak than the cattle egret. Then the one that I mentioned before that gives the most trouble is that young little blue heron, which is also pure white, but its beak, it's a bit less sharp, honestly, than the snowy egret. It's a bit more of a stout beak, and it doesn't have those yellow lores that the snowy egret has. It's also not nearly as stocky as the cattle egret, and its bill is dark, kind of a gray rather than that orange. And so with those kind of the combination of the size, the general shape, and then that bill especially, you can get really good at identifying some of these white herons and egrets. But just to toss, a little bit more into the confusion, here we've got the reddish egret and the great blue heron. And in Florida, these guys can also be pure white, and they're not albino. They have populations in Florida that are pure white. But the reddish egret, its white morph, shares that really pink and black bill. So that could be a good ID feature. It's got these fluffy neck feathers, and it's very active when it's foraging. Just by behavior alone, you can tell a reddish egret from most of the other herons and egrets. The great blue heron also has a white morph, but it's very rare, generally only in South Florida, but it looks like a huge, large-billed version of a great egret. A few other groups of birds that, they require a bit of study and practice are the warblers, especially in the fall when they aren't singing. And many are in this kind of drab, similar looking plumage. Just looking at the field guide, here's just a page out of Sibley, my Sibley field guide. A lot of these warblers can look pretty similar. And so they take, a bit of effort to really nail down. Same story goes for the sparrows, all clad in kind of streaky brown. The songs are really helpful in IDing these guys. But also helpful in Florida is the fact that in Florida, you generally don't see that many species of sparrows. This book is for all of the eastern US. And so in Florida, you really only have 2 or 3 that you generally have to worry about. And then finally, here's, the gulls and the terns. Get very familiar with the reason, with the common species, and then it'll be easier to pick out those rare ones. So for Florida, you should know the laughing gull, the ring-billed gull, the royal tern and sandwich tern, and the black skimmer. And if you know these guys, and I'll show them here, then I think you'll have a good base. That's most of the birds that you'll see at the beach. Then you'll be able to pick out the rare ones from there. So the laughing gull, their breeding plumage, very distinctive with their nice black head and red bills. Ring-billed gulls, if you get a good look at that bill, it's yellow with kind of a black band right around the middle. That can be good for IDing them. Royal tern with the orange bill compared to sandwich tern with the black bill and the yellow tip. And then black skimmer, kind of really long wings, all black on the back with that huge, awkward looking orange and black bill with that giant lower mandible. And while I definitely don't want to belittle the effort and time that it takes to learn the birds in the US, it can be interesting to look at foreign field guides to see what birders in other countries have to deal with, or if you travel. Here's 8 different species of scrub wrens in Papua New Guinea that are all identical to me, at least. They're just brown, same shape even. And then just, this just gets absurd. Here's the plates for honey eaters. These are all one family of birds found in New Guinea. And if you look at one of those pages, here we've got it's insanity. This is 10 species that all look identical. And so sometimes the only way to identify these guys is to actually put up a net and get the bird in the hand and measure the feathers to get the differences. And that being said, mist netting is actually a very important way to study birds. You can take the measurements, you can check for fat and molt. You can put an identifying tag on the bird, usually a band or a ring around the leg. And then, as I mentioned, some species are almost impossible to ID without a very up-close study. So not every bird that you see around Florida is really supposed to be there, especially in Florida, where there are many species of plants and animals that have been introduced because Florida, it's this port where there's a lot of stuff being, kind of shipped to places like Miami and Tampa from the Caribbean and South America, but also because it's just this warm tropical climate. So any animals that escape and get loose in Florida can pretty much just live there. One of the more common species that you will see is the Eurasian collared dove. Looks like kind of a big mourning dove, but it's got this nice black collar on the back of the neck. It's supposed to be in Eurasia. but Florida has them, as well as European starlings, house sparrows, gray-headed swamp hen, which is kind of a purple gallinule look-alike, and then a number of parrots, particularly around the big cities. Not all unexpected species, though, are introduced by people. Occasionally, you can see vagrants, birds that are not usually found in an area, and it's basically just lost. Weather events like strong winds or hurricanes can cause a lot of vagrants to show up, sometimes blowing seabirds really far inland, or pushing Caribbean species right up into Florida. And then sometimes young birds don't migrate in the proper direction, and they end up thousands of miles from where they're supposed to be. And of course, birds can fly, most of them, and so sometimes they just end up kind of not where we're expecting them. So this bird here is a brown-backed solitaire. It's a bird, a songbird of the Mexican highlands. But I took these pictures back in high school in Arizona, and this bird ended up being the first record of this species ever seen in the United States. Birds, they can just show up, so you don't want to count anything out just because it's not supposed to be there. So where can you go to find and see all these birds? Maybe you want to know what birds have been seen in a particular park or county. Or on the flip side, maybe you have a target bird and you just want to know where you have to drive to find it. Well, look no further than Ebird. This incredible citizen science platform has enormous amounts of data, and you can contribute to it too. You can post your own sightings for others to see, and you can access everybody else's sightings to learn about what birds have been seen where. Let's say you want to find a specific bird, like a purple gallinule. You can click on the species maps down here, type in purple gallinule, and you can zoom in on Florida, and here you go. We've got a map of sightings of purple gallinule. You can zoom in and see exactly where these guys have been seen. And here, blue little dots are places where they've been seen in the past, and orange dots are places people have seen purple gallinule in the last 30 days. And this is up to date. I took this screenshot of the Ebird just a couple days ago. So all of these orange places are places you could go and have a decent chance of seeing purple gallinule. And then with the reverse approach, you can zoom out and look at hotspots, all the places instead of the birds. And then you can find a place that you want to go, like let's say Brooker Creek. And you can click on the little hotspot flag, and it'll tell you all of the birds that have been seen there and what date they were most recently seen and who saw them. And so that's a really great way to get to know an area. One thing you want to get to know and be aware of is sample bias here. For Ebird, the biggest sample bias comes from where most people are located. If you look at a map, here there's a map of snowy owl sightings, and I'm sure there's snowy owls all throughout Canada, but there's just no people in Canada, so there's no sightings there. So just because something's not reported on Ebird or an iNaturalist doesn't mean it's not there. Maybe it just means those sites, they need you to go there and report what's actually around. And for Florida specifically, this bias can really manifest itself in locations or parks that have much lower reported diversity than is probably true. So of course, islands connected to the mainland with causeways or bridges are just going to have more people and therefore more sightings and reports than islands that are not connected by bridges that you need a boat to get to. So somewhere like Honeymoon Island State Park, has 300 species of birds seen there, whereas just its next door neighbor, which has pretty much the same habitats and everything, probably pretty much the same actual bird list, has less than half the number of species reported because you need a boat to get there. Okay, so in the last few minutes here, we'll just kind of go through a few cool species and crazy behaviors that you can check out. First, I'm going to talk about the common nighthawk, which is one of the weirdest little birds. This picture, it is doing a broken wing display. And so this bird, when it nests on the ground. And if predators get too close to the nest, the parents will flop around on the ground and nearby trees, pretending to look injured so that predators will follow the parents and then basically lose track of the nest, which is really camouflaged on the ground. And then the parents will kind of lead the predator farther and farther away, and then they'll regain their ability to fly, and they'll fly up into a tree to keep an eye on their nest. And by that point, the predator, maybe a coyote or a fox or something, will be maybe 100 feet away from the nest, and the baby that camouflages itself in the leaf litter is really tough to re-find. The swallow-tailed kite, one of the coolest birds that Florida has, in my opinion. You'll see them, if not already, you'll see them soon. They're a summertime bird over Brooker Creek. And here, this one is eating a part of a bee's nest. It's kind of cool. You can actually watch these guys, and sometimes they'll swoop down into the canopy and they'll grab like a wasp nest or something out of the trees. And I'm pretty sure they're eating like the larvae and the actual insects that are in the nest here. And so that's kind of a cool behavior. You know, it's a raptor. You think, you know, they're eating lizards and birds in the trees, but they will also actually take these wasp nests, which is kind of cool. And then there's a whole range of really interesting breeding behaviors and dances that you can watch at rookeries. Here we have the anhinga that kind of leans over and does this weird little flapping thing with his wings while it's doing an interesting kind of growly vocalization. And also in rookeries, things like snowy egrets, their elaborate plumes, they dance, they do this weird bobbing thing where they kind of point their head at the sky and jump a little bit. And if you'll notice, it's not just the feathers that are especially cool during breeding season. These guys, the feet and the lores, which are usually bright yellow, change to almost deep red or deep orange here. And that's like the skin, the actual facial skin is changing color when they're in this like really high breeding plumage. Same thing goes for these great egrets. Again, beautiful plumes, big dances in these rookeries, and the facial skin, it's not the feathers that are changing, it's the skin near their eyes when they're in the breeding season is bright green. But of course, being in rookeries means you're in close quarters with a lot of birds with big sharp bills. And so it's a fun place to go and watch a whole bunch of interesting behaviors, both the dancing, but also some aggressive sort of territorial behaviors. You know, if these birds are nesting too close together, an anhinga and a wood stork here are not really getting along. Another bird that has kind of an interesting little breeding sort of display, terns will often present food to a potential mate. You know, they can square off and kind of do kind of a little dance, but not necessarily as elaborate as some of the herons and egrets, but it can be fun to watch. You know, springtime, go down to the beach and check these guys out. Another interesting behavior, the reddish egret. I mentioned how they can be identified from a distance just by their behavior. Instead of sitting and waiting for a little fish to kind of swim by and then striking, the reddish egret dances. It runs around through the shallow water, waving its wings, trying to scare up any little critters. And then when it sees them move, then it kind of leaps forward and darts and attacks. So they're kind of a very fun sort of active hunter to watch out in coastal lagoons and on the beach. And then the last of the interesting Florida bird behaviors is the black skimmer with that really long lower bill. You know, it's the one bird that has a lower mandible that's longer than the upper mandible. And you can watch it in kind of calm coastal waters and lagoons, flying low and then skimming, that's how they get their name, their lower bill through the water. And when it hits something, hopefully a fish and not, you know, a shipwreck or something underwater, if it hits a fish, then they clamp their jaws shut really quick and they can catch fish and squid, things like that, right from the surface of the water. There are a few other birds that are really interesting that are not from Florida that I just want to highlight real quick, just because they're cool. And, you know, once, you know, if COVID ever goes away and people get to travel again, maybe these are some birds you want to go travel and try and see. The American dipper. This is one, you know, that I have here in Oregon. It's the only songbird in the country that goes completely underwater. It dives all the way underwater to hunt in these little fast flowing mountainy streams and creeks. So that's kind of a cool behavior for a songbird to have. Things like grouse doing these crazy displays. They're all their feathers, you know, they look like they're basically mini turkeys, but they can inflate different parts of their body. This guy has inflated not only his little neck sacs to make sounds, but he's like inflated the skin around his eyebrows, this orange inflated skin. It's just crazy looking. You know, so there's just lots of birds out there to check out. And then a broad, there's just so many types of birds. Once you get, if you ever get bored of the birds in Florida, which is tough to do because there's so many species of birds in Florida. But if you ever get bored, going to other countries, you can find all manner of different weird behaviors. This guy, a dusky broadbill, is making a fake nest hanging from a vine so that predators will go to this fake nest and not its real nest. And then, you think of pigeons, like kind of these weird gray, boring birds. But in other countries, here's an orange-bellied fruit dove in New Guinea. And these are just pigeons that are just bright green with purple and orange. And, just birds are awesome. That's pretty much what I'll leave this whole talk with, is birds are awesome. And if you have any questions about that, then I will be happy to take them now.
Brian, thank you so much. We do have a couple of questions that came in throughout, and a few comments that you might want to weigh in on as well. Number one, if anyone is looking for a pair of binoculars, what would you suggest being, kind of the basics for looking for in a pair of binoculars? And if you have a favorite brand, of course, we don't advertise any particular brand, but if you have a favorite, go ahead and let us know.
Yeah. The ones that I use are Nikon Monarch binoculars, and I've had them for over 10 or 12 years now. They're great. Basically, you want something that's not just, kind of a light plastic sort of feel, something that's not just a $20 pair that looks like it's a little closer, but it's just like a kid's magnifying glass on a toilet paper tube. I think any sort of binoculars that are between, I'd say, the $100 and $400 range, that's kind of the bulk where you've gotten into some good optics that you will use and you'll love, and you don't need to go anything beyond that. I've got friends who are birder, like professional type ornithologist people, and they've got multi-$1,000 binoculars. And the difference between my old used couple $100 binoculars and my friends like $3,000 Swarovski binoculars, I don't notice a very big difference. So yeah, if you want to look at, my specific brand that I like is the Nikon Monarchs. I haven't really tried very many others. But yeah, you want to just, it's an investment. It's something that you'll use for many years. If you keep good care of them, it's a tool that you'll have, and they're very useful.
Wonderful. Good to hear it doesn't have to cost too much money. Birding being one of the cheapest hobbies probably around.
Yeah.
A comment from Danny wanted to point out that Danny uses an app called BirdNet for bird songs. Are you familiar with that?
Yes, I feel like I used to have that app. I haven't used it recently. I would have to check it out. But I feel like I am vaguely aware of its existence, but not enough to talk about it here.
Okay, that's something that our guests can Google around for. An app called BirdNet. Just BirdNet is something you might consider playing with for bird song. Suzanne wanted to point out that snowy egrets have yellow feet, and that comparing all the white waders. So thanks, Suzanne, for that.
Yes, that's definitely a good one also.
Irma's wondering what kind of sparrows we have in Florida. Irma's just got here from Ohio and is just kind of curious about that particular group of birds.
Cool. Yeah, so the house sparrow is kind of the city dweller. It's not even really, it's an old world sparrow. It's introduced. In terms of the New World sparrows, that family, the song sparrow is pretty much the most common. You'll see a lot of song sparrow. And then there are savanna sparrows and swamp sparrow. There's a few sparrows. I'd say the song sparrow is the most common. And if you learn its song and kind of what it looks like, then that's a good jumping off point. If you know the song sparrow and you know what's not a song sparrow, then you'll start being able to piece them together a bit.
And there's the critically endangered or just endangered enough grasshopper sparrow, right?
Yes, there's grasshopper sparrow. Florida also has, I think it's Bachman sparrow in some of the nice kind of grassy, drier habitats, and seaside sparrow. There's a couple of salt marsh sort of specialties as well. Yeah, for a lot of the sparrows, I would say, if you go on Ebird and look up those bar charts, figure out what's around in the area, and then compare that to a field guide. And for any given habitat, for any given time of the year, there's only really a handful that you have to bother with.
All right. Good luck looking for sparrows, Irma. Regina would like to know, other than the chuckwill's widow and the killdeer, any other broken wing displayers, that interesting behavior?
Yeah, so we've got those, all the night jars. So, the chuckwill's widow, the nighthawk, the killdeer. I feel like you usually don't see it as much in other shorebirds, but I don't think killdeer are the only ones that do it. I think there are other plovers that will do it as well. And then there are some birds that go the opposite route, of course, and just dive bomb you. And, they don't try and lead you away subtly. They attack. And so there's some interesting ones to be found out there. But yeah, in terms of the broken wing display, the killdeer is by far the most well known and the most easily observed, especially because they often nest in parking lots. They're putting themselves, I say they're putting themselves kind of in where people are, but we're the ones that, bulldozed all their habitat and put the parking lot there in the first place. So, that's on us.
Right. Cheryl has a question, just a clarification question about the difference when you refer to escapees versus vagrants versus introduced species.
Yeah.
Can you think of an escapee, a vagrant, and an introduced species in Florida?
Okay, yeah. So I think the main difference, so a vagrant is one that has not really gotten there by human means. A vagrant is one that has blown off course, or just, it's flown there of its own accord. And generally, in terms of counting a bird, like for your life list or something, or for reporting it, vagrants are the most interesting because it got there on its own. It's like, wow, how did an albatross get all the way into, the Midwest? And, it's kind of a crazy example, but that sort of thing happens after a hurricane. So a vagrant for Florida would be anything pretty much from the Caribbean. So in Miami, things like Western spindalis and bananaquit, those are kind of some vagrants that people often look for, those Caribbean species. An introduced species would be one that either intentionally or unintentionally has a population, a breeding population there, and it wasn't there before people, it was there because of people, but it's here to stay. And so for an introduced species, the most well introduced to the detriment of other birds are the European starling and house sparrow. Some of the more recent ones would be Nande parakeet. There are populations of those bright green parakeets throughout parts of Florida. You can see them near Weeden Island, Nande parakeets, and I've seen them in Riverview, Florida too. There's just little pockets of them, but they're self-sustaining populations. So those are introduced species. And then an escapee would be one that we consider more likely to just have been like somebody's pet that got out. And we don't count that. If somebody has a pet jaguar and it escapes, and runs around the Everglades, that's not, there's not a population of jaguars living in the Everglades. So that'd be an escaped species. So for a bird, that's oftentimes flamingos. Occasionally, there are actually American flamingo vagrants that show up in South Florida, but it is sometimes tough to prove whether it was a vagrant that got there on its own or an escapee from a zoo. And so the flamingo, I'd say, is one of the more common escapees that you'll see in the news sometimes with the Florida birds.
Got it. Well, thank you very, very much. We have one more question. It could be considered maybe psychic ornithology. if you could identify a medium black bird with a yellowish orange beak. Take your pick.
If it has to be in Florida, let's see. That sound, there's a Eurasian blackbird that sounds identical to that. That'd be in Europe. Medium blackbird, yellowish orange beak. That is probably honestly the starling. The European starling is dark, glossy, but it has this nice long, sharp, yellowish orange beak. I would not bet a lot of money, but I'd bet a little bit of money on that one.
And that was introduced, wasn't that one of the birds that someone wanted to establish all of Shakespeare's birds?
Yeah. Yeah, that's the awful story behind, one of the biggest conservation problems in ornithology is, this guy back in like 1850s, 60s, I don't know, over 100 or maybe about 100 years ago, something back there, 1860s or 70s, I think.
Back in my day.
Yeah, he thought that the birds that were mentioned in Shakespeare's plays were all so amazing that they should be everywhere. And, Shakespeare's in Europe. And so he's like, oh, all these European birds, they should be everywhere. Let's bring them to the New World. And so he introduces a few pairs of starlings and house sparrows to Central Park in New York. And here we are a century later with like 1 billion starlings.
Wow. All good intentions.
Yeah.
And the outcomes weren't so great. Brian, thank you so much for presenting for us this morning, afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm sure you're ready to rest your voice and get a drink of water. Thank you again, and thank all of you for joining us. As mentioned, this presentation will be recorded and more of Brian and available on our YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube and search UF-IFAS extension Pinellas and look for the Brooker Creek Preserve playlist. And here you will find, once the video is ready in maybe a couple of days time, a recording so you can watch it all again and learn again and again and again, which is what it takes. So thanks all for joining us. Thank you, Brian, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, guys.